Hey, this is John F. Murs, author, actor, and owner of 1021 Studios, and you're listening to Citywide Blackout.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Max Bowen.
And I'm Curtis Hughes. And Max, we have a great show for everyone today.
We do. But before we get rolling, Curtis, I have a question for you, man. Do you like zombie stories?
Of course.
You like a good old-fashioned like zombie apocalypse? You know, everything in ruins, society's crumbled, everyone's dead.
Everybody's walking around. You don't really know what's going on. You're just kind of running away from this person.
Doing the dance too, right? They do the dance? Or am I getting things mixed up again?
I think we're getting mixed up again.
All right.
Anyway.
Well, you know what? Then let us pivot here because our next guest has created a really unique take on the zombie genre. The book is called One of the Dead. The man is Richard Farren Barber. Richard, welcome to the show. It is great to have you here, man.
Great to be here, Max and Curtis.
All right. And just to show everyone what an absolute badass this guy is, where he is calling from, it is 1 a.m, okay? So he is making this work. He is making this work. Of course, want to give a big shout out to the folks at Crystal Lake Entertainment because they helped put this whole thing together. That's where you get the book from. You've heard the name several times already. You check them out. They've got so many great books coming out, many out already. But to your book now, Richard, you know, Curtis and I were talking kind of prior to the show, and we love this take on like the zombie genre. It's very different from most. To give folks a quick little run through, this book, the zombies look like you and I. They look like regular folks, and they don't bite you. They don't eat your brains. They don't devour your flesh. They simply touch you and basically take your soul away, making you one of them. And this isn't some global apocalypse either. This is kind of located to one small area. So, Richard, the first question to you would be just how did the concept for these zombies come about?
Well, I'm glad you like the book. By accident, really. It wasn't supposed to be a zombie book by any means at all. I was just playing around with the idea of a character who knew that the dead were around. And it's only as I wrote it and wrote more and more that I really like the zombies as a genre and a trope within horror. But I think it's that bit about sometimes you've just read the same thing too many times. So I was just trying to take it a bit left field and do something a bit different with this one.
You really achieved that. I like that. And to give folks a little more look into this book, so this one focuses on the main character, Nick. He has the rare ability to see these zombies for what they really are. He doesn't see people. He sees the actual living dead. And of course, they're going after his girlfriend, Abby. Because of course they are. They have to do that. And this really isn't meant to be like a horror story exactly. It's also meant to be kind of a love story too. How do these two genres kind of intertwine?
For me, the two are never far apart because especially when I'm writing horror, one of the things I find really fascinating about horror is when it works, it's about emotions. So it's as much as it's about blood and guts, it's about emotions. And I think when you read writers who really work the genre, it's about them making you care for the characters. So that's what I was trying to do in my own way, is actually give Nick a bit of 3D and give him some people that he cares for and that he has a reason for fighting again for.
But this book does have plenty of gore, right? Because we have to have
God,
that.
Yeah.
Oh, thank God.
Oh,
phew.
Oh, I wouldn't want to leave that out by any means.
I was worried there for a second. I was really worried there.
And so we kind of touched on the fact that the zombies in this book are slightly different from your regular, ordinary, run-of-the-mill common zombies that you would run into. But what are the rules for the zombies in this story? You know, most common zombie stories have, like taking a, rocket launcher or a rifle and shooting their heads off, and that's the end of it. But how do we deal with these zombies in this book?
So for me, one of the rules was about the idea that they'd have to keep returning to their victim, and so that it wasn't just a one bite fits all kind of scenario. That because again, it's that bringing that relationship back, bringing them back into a point of peril, so that it's not like for Nick and his girlfriend, what's happened is happened, and that's the end of it. So for me, the zombies had to keep coming back to their victims and slowly taking away their life force, rather than it being one quick thing. And I think so that also gave me the opportunity to say, actually, if that's their strength, that's also their vulnerability, which is that ability to kind of put yourself between the zombie and their food source, if you like. It's like getting in the way of Sainsbury's or Walmart.
Accurate.
Very
Accurate.
much so. And so we talk about the life force and, one touch, and it starts to drain the individuals, from the soul from their bodies. But, what happens to the soul after the zombie gets them?
Very good question. I think this sounds terrible as a writer saying I'm not sure, but my own feeling is that actually, in the end, as with all good tropes, you end up being subsumed. So your life force goes into that of the zombie. If you're lucky, you end up as a zombie yourself, but that doesn't always happen. You just need a bit of luck on your side in order to get to that next stage.
And I'm sure everyone in this book is very lucky. One thing I was really curious about, Richard, is the scope of this book. Are we talking about like hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of living dead, or is it just a smaller group?
Oh, it's very, very small. I mean, this book is my home city of Nottingham in the UK is very much where this is set. I moved away for a number of years, but I now live within like 20 miles away, so it's close enough for me to get to. And that was one of the motivations of the book, is actually to set it in places that I knew as a kid and that I could still visualize. So it's very much a small number of individuals within a city of 500,000 people. So a part of it is just to try and pick out who is and is not infected.
Do you turn your neighbors into zombies?
Not in this book. Oh no! When you forget things. Actually, some of this book is, and I haven't said this to any of my neighbours because I still want to talk to them, is actually set in the street where I live. And some of the characters, without having a lawyer sitting beside me, are not a million miles away from people that I know. But hopefully none of them that would recognise it.
Now you're gonna get that call. It's like, so Rich, happened to read your book. Why am I the zombie?
Emptying the bins in the morning is going to be very different from now on.
Right, it's going to be super awkward. All right, so let's talk a bit about Abby, because she's obviously very central to the whole story. She's Nick's motivation for getting involved in this particular fight. But she's not running from this rampaging horde of zombies. She's running from like just one zombie, one being that is obsessed with her. Who is this being, and why are they so focused on turning Abby?
So I think going back to Curtis's question about the rules, I think there is that relationship that gets built between the zombie and their prey, and the idea that they're quite monogamous creatures. So once they've picked a prey, they stick with that person, and they completely take every ounce of their life force before they move on to the next victim. So it is quite a moral way of looking at things. If you're a zombie, actually you stick loyal to your first victim and stay there until the end. And for me, I think with Abby, one of the things I really liked was the idea that actually she is quite oblivious, and that puts Nick in a really difficult position, because he can't really explain what's going on without sounding absolutely crazy. And then when you're dealing with your nearest and dearest, how do you make that leap from sanity to what seems externally to be insanity?
And I imagine if Nick were to just like shoot, one of these like zombies in the head or whatever, it would just look like he was committing murder. Oh,
absolutely. Yeah. It would be completely against the moral code of where he lives.
Yeah. Well, I think like any moral code, really. I'm going to guess that most places do kind of frown on the whole like slaughtering your neighbors. But that leads to another question. If you kill one of these zombies, do they revert back to being creatures, or do they still look like the people that they were?
If you do manage to kill them, and to be honest, there's not a lot of, I mean, again, set in the UK, so we don't have an awful lot of guns to go around shooting zombies' heads off. So it is more relying on almost effectively starving them to death. So you basically you remove their food source and they slowly wither away because they're decaying, because they're using the food that they've had, and there's nothing left for them once they've stopped feeding. So basically they wither into nothingness and basically crumble into dust.
It's funny you mentioned the part about the guns because, yeah, like in the U.S., it's always everyone's got a gun. Everyone's got like 6 guns. There's just no shortage of bullets. Yeah, different countries, different situations, I imagine. But let's pivot to Nick now. So he is of course the main character. He's the hero of the story. Tell us a little more about how Nick came to be.
So Nick's ability. I think Nick is very completely tied to his ability to see the dead, and that is something that just runs through his entire life. It's something he's inherited either through genes or through the whole nature nurture thing from his parents. So his parents were also able to see the dead, and so he now has that same ability. There's an interesting thing which I don't get into in too much detail in the book is it something that is innate within him biologically, or is it something that he's been taught? And then that then ties into, well, actually, if it is taught, can you then teach it to other people? And do you then start to have a group? And I quite like the fact that he doesn't try and tell anyone else. He is very much isolated by his ability. So because he can see the dead, and because, to be honest, knowing that and being on your own, that's a lot of trouble to try and fight an apocalypse single-handedly without any guns. So you're kind of stuck with kitchen knives and the odd baseball bat. So his approach has been to retreat into himself and basically pretend that this doesn't exist. And basically, from a moral point of view, just close his eyes to everything he sees going on around him. And that lasts for a while. That keeps him going for a period of time, but at some point that dam breaks and he has to intervene. He finds himself having to intervene.
Is that moment him kind of accepting that, yes, this is actually real, I can't ignore it anymore?
Not so much that it's real. I think he's always accepted it's real because of the devastation it's had in his own family life and the impact it's had on his parents, decades before. What I think happens to him is, and it's almost an aberration where for a moment he forgets all of his defense mechanisms of just pretending that the zombies don't exist, pretending that he can just ignore them. He has almost like an enlightened moment of moral certainty where he just has to intervene, and he does it without thinking about it. And it's that doing effectively the right thing without any thought to it that actually then brings all the trouble out to him. So he does it the right thing, but almost for the wrong reasons.
Okay. Now, he's had this power before this book begins. It's something that has been around for a while. How does that affect him, being able to see all this weird stuff?
I think mainly it makes him very isolated. So even like his relationship with Abby is very, there are walls there and things that he cannot talk about and he will not talk about. And I think that creates an immediate distance between them. You have to wonder how a relationship can cope with that permanent, very large secret there. So he can pretend it doesn't exist, but at some point he's going to have to acknowledge it. And I think trying to get over that, here's the secret he's been carrying for a long time, and explain it to Abby is one of the biggest challenges he has to face.
It's definitely one of the more awkward we had to talk situations.
Definitely.
So, sweetheart, I see the dead like a lot. I still love you though. You're awesome. But yeah, that's a thing that we're gonna have to deal with.
Yeah. And I didn't mention it for the X number of years that we've been together.
Yeah,
so,
right.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Time for therapy.
Oh, I think that ship sailed, Curtis, long time ago. Sailed, sunk, and rusting at the
Too
bottom.
late. You can always start.
Well, in this case.
Enjoying the podcast? Get even more of the content you love from artists around the world on Citywide Bites. Experience the show live on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Instagram. With our interactive short-form interview series, you can ask your questions and be a part of the action. Hosted by Max Bowen.
How about Nick as a fighter of the undead? I mean, he doesn't strike me as the most like gung-ho kind of character.
No, he's not been doing a lot of bench presses as Nick. He's very for so many reasons, he's very ineffective at what he does. I mean, his main, as I said, his main approach is to try and starve them out by locking gates and the like, which isn't really, nobody's ever going to make an action character of Nick Teal in that kind of way. So he is very ineffective in what he does, mainly because he's never built up any sort of approaches to fighting the dead. His approach has always been quite cowardly, and I say that's terrible saying he's cowardly, but yeah, I think he is quite cowardly and he runs away. And that's been approached for so long until he's forced to actually face up to it.
So let's talk about the settings of the book. How did you find them? Obviously, there are places that were very familiar to you from the past, but as you thought about writing the scenes and the settings for the book, what made you go, this location I think is good for chapter 1 and so on and so forth?
So in many ways, the setting was the start of the book before anything else. So the opening scene where Nick is standing in the middle of what is the market square of Nottingham, which is, for those of you who've been to Nottingham, which is probably not many, it's an open area right in the middle. It's a concreted area right in the middle of the city, and it's quite odd because it is that open grey space. And that was my opening scene. It's always my opening scene about Nick standing in the middle of there, sensing what was going to come. So that was where I started from. And then I think the other big scene for me, and it is a big part of the book in terms of settings, is the graveyard. The graveyard is also real. It's in Nottingham. When I went to school, it was the graveyard I passed on the way to school every day. And therefore, obviously, as kids, it was the place where you had lots and lots of theories and mythologies about what happened. So going past there on Halloween, for example, was terrifying. Genuinely, like, I'd be a 12-year-old and you'd go across it at night and you'd be looking in the graveyard for lights and things. So that graveyard is kind of part of my psyche from a very young age. So it was definitely going to be in there.
And the graveyard that we talked about just a second ago, is that the exact same graveyard that's being used as the book cover?
No, we kind of sourced a picture for the book cover from an amazing cover artist. This is when you talked about Crystal Lake at the beginning. I think they're brilliant at putting books together, and one of the things they're really, really good at, and Joe is really good at, is sourcing artists. And the cover, which is by Joe Halesh, is just stunning. I mean, I just said it's something along these lines. Here's one of the characters. And what she came up with was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, when we first saw the cover, Max and I first went like, we got to ask. That's just like an awesome, really creepy, spooky cover.
Yeah, I was really, really impressed with what she produced.
Definitely. Is this your first time working with Crystal Lake? We've had a lot of the writers on the show over the years.
This is my second book with Crystal Lake. So the first one was 20 Years Dead, which came out about... I've decided all my books with Crystal Lake seem to have dead in the title somewhere, and I'm slightly worried about what that means about me as a writer. But, dead is good. So this is the second one. The 20 Years Dead was basically... I won't go into it too much detail, but basically the premise of that is that when you die, and you'll see where the title comes from, exactly 20 years to the minute that you died, you reawaken for about 5 minutes. And so it's an opportunity for the family to get back together and find out all the family secrets that have been hidden for that period of time. So you got a couple of minutes of the dead person waking up again, very disoriented in very different states, and then they die again. So that was that one. But that was about a year and a half ago. Crystal Lake produced that one.
Yeah, that sounded like a really cool book, because we were like checking out some of your other works and we saw this. I thought, man, this is a wonderful concept. Did this in any way kind of pave the way for One of the Dead?
Well, actually, I wrote One of the Dead about 10 years ago, and for years, and I think because the way I started writing it from a scene rather than a story. It took an awful lot of rewrites, more than I've done with any other novella. So this one was written a number of years before I can't even remember the name of my other book now. 20 Years Dead. So this was written long before, and I just kept rewriting because it wasn't working for a number of drafts. It took a long time for it to come together to something that I would actually dare to show anyone.
Writers always say that. They'll always say, my first draft, it was crap. It'll never see the light of day. I burned it. How different would you say, though, the book was from the first draft to what we have now?
Oh, I'm going to go along with my first drafts are truly. My first drafts are so bad, I cannot sit and read them. I have to line edit them just to make them bad enough to read. But this one changed. I mean, the whole structure of this book changed. Between the first draft, I think this was the 9th draft that finally went out to Crystal Lake for consideration. There was probably a third of it completely missing. The first 3 chapters of the original book just got put in the bin very quickly. So yeah, quite a big change.
Yeah, I'll bet. How about Nick? Was he a very different person from like draft 1 to current book?
I think in the first draft he kind of just ambled around, so he didn't have a lot of motivation. I mean, one of the things I was interested with Nick is, and I quite like it as a character flaw, which is characters who don't run in and are gung-ho and all brave, but actually almost end up having to face things and face challenges despite their own desires, and then they're kind of dragged kicking and screaming into confrontation rather than rushing towards it. And I think in the first few, I took that too far, and he was just way too passive, and he just kind of ambled around Nottingham and not really doing anything at all, and kind of just stumbling into conflict. And so I had to give him a bit of a backbone, even if I did want to leave him a little bit cowardly still.
Oh yeah. I think for a book like this, you can't have your main character be like a badass, because it takes like the fun out of it. You don't worry about him then.
Yeah, and personally, given that I'm a 9-stone weakling, I can't really associate too well with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So when I'm reading a book, if it's someone who's as weak and tepid as me, that works quite well.
Oh yeah, I think the writer's backstory always influences the main characters in some way or another, because they're going to write from their comfort zone, and if they happen to like serve in the military or they're a police officer, what have you, they're going to make a more badass character, because that's the kind of way that they think. They can't think in a different way. Anyway, moving on. I could be on this all day, I think. This book, as you mentioned, of course, very different take on the zombie genre. And the zombie genre itself is very full these days. Lots of new books, of course, movies, The Walking Dead. Do you feel like the genre needs a massive shift to stay relevant, to stay fresh?
To an extent, I think what tends to happen with horror is it seems to go through cycles where you have different genres and different tropes which become the excitement, whether it's vampires or zombies or ghosts. And yeah, I think maybe it's starting to fade a bit, but yeah, over the last few years it felt like everything was zombie, and I thought, now we just need to give it a rest, give it time to freshen up. Let's move on to something else, and then we'll pick it back up again in 5-10 years as a genre, and we'll see what's happened then.
It's funny because I can recall when The Walking Dead, the comic, first came out, and this was years before the actual show happened and thing became this global sensation. And I was just seeing this massive surge. Like all of a sudden you're seeing all kinds of new zombie comics and books and movies and video games and everything else. It was just like that, like they saw it as this license to print money, which it was, to be honest. And I think it came to a point where it was kind of bloated. It got to a point where it's like, guys, we need something different. Come on, something else.
Yeah, and I don't want to criticize The Walking Dead, but I was chatting to my brother at the weekend, but I stopped watching it at about season 8 or 9 when it felt like they'd run out of story and they were just reinventing the same stories with slightly different characters. But I just remember that first episode that I saw of it just being completely blown away.
Oh, God, yeah.
And I thought it was a different scale to anything I'd ever seen before. I thought it was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, the opening scene where Rick thinks he's found some like kid, some survivor, turns out to be a zombie, and he just sort of like very like resigningly just like shoots her in the head, Yeah. Spoiler alert, guys. I just spoiled the first scene for you. Sorry about that. You had years to watch it. But yeah, I think every so often you need that kind of shift for something to remain like awesome. Otherwise, it's just the same old story.
Yeah.
We've been talking about this current work, but you're no stranger to writing. You've written a lot of books over the years. I'd like to ask about your first book. What was your first story?
My first story that I finished, because interestingly, the first novel I ever tried to write was, oh dear God, 30 plus years ago, was set in the same cemetery that is in One of the Dead. So it was set in the same place. I wrote about 5 or 6 chapters. And I remember because I hand wrote it all. And if you go back to it, clearly I was doing it over a summer when I was about 18 years old. I was writing the date when I started writing a piece, and then I'd write the time when I finished it. So I was a bit too focused on that. But and it was based in that same cemetery. The first book I ever had published was a novella, and I can't even remember the name of it. That's terrible, isn't it? I'm useless with remembering my own work. It'll come to me eventually.
Right.
But that was published about 10, 15 years ago. And it is interesting in terms of when I go back to it now, I think what you see as a writer as you develop is you see all the you don't see any of the good, you just see all the flaws and think, oh, why did I write that? Or that's really clunky. And I think there's always a danger that you just want to keep going back and rewriting the book to make it better with what you've learned since, instead of forging on.
I'm the same way with this show because this is about 15 years old now at this point, and I listen to older interviews and think, oh man, that was a terrible lead-in, it's a terrible question. What the hell was I thinking? Why did they let me stay on do this thing? So yeah, I think you look at your early stuff and think, man, this was just not good at all.
Yeah,
everyone's their own critic though too, you know.
True enough. True.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm always torn between trying to be positive and say, well, the fact that I can see how rubbish it is shows that I've developed, but then the part of me goes, yeah, but I thought that was good back then. So how bad is the stuff I'm writing? I shouldn't say. I'm not Crystal Lake will kill me for this one. I'm thinking, how bad is the stuff I'm writing now, and what will I think about it in 5-10 years time? I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure it's great.
Joe's like, Arr.
Any minute now there'll be a phone call saying, Richard, can you get off the line?
You know, one of the things that we saw that really surprised us was that you've done about 56 works to date, and this is a combination of like novels, novellas, short stories, and as you mentioned, 30 years doing this stuff. Is writing easier for you now after all this time?
The numbers are actually a lot higher than that, by the way. That's
whoops.
only the published stuff. Yeah, no, it's not your fault. No, that's only the published stuff. There's a lot of dross hanging around in there and stuff. That I have a bad habit of writing first drafts and then getting excited, and then instead of editing the first draft, writing another first draft. I have lots of novellas and novels, basically, that have finished first drafts and have not got any further. I think it's easier in the sense that I feel more confident that I think if I start a book, I know. Whereas, going back to that first book where I got through 5 or 6 chapters and then stopped, I think now when I start a piece of work, I have a rough idea of where it's going, and I have a confidence that I know I'm going to get to the end of it. So I think I've got enough books under my belt to know that I can keep the energy going to the end of the book. I think some of it is just habit. I mean, I'm very habitual in terms of writing at the same time every day and not waiting for something to come up with a new idea. So I think you just get into a routine of writing to an extent.
Gotcha. All right, folks. Well, we are coming down to the end of this conversation. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question. This is, of course, a horror story. It's a zombie story. Richard, what would you say is your best kill scene in this book?
Without giving too much away, and although it's not a kill scene per se, one of the favourite parts, and I knew it even before I wrote it, is there is a scene where there are remains of a body, but the body itself is gone, and all you have is the bed with like the stain on the bed and maggots. And I quite like maggots. I think there's something really revolting about maggots. Maybe as a kid, I once came across a pigeon that was very dead and very covered in maggots, and I think that stuck with me. So there's something really, the yellowy white wrigglingness of a maggot, I think is always great and is never out of place in a horror story.
I like this. I like this little peek that we're getting into your like inner psyche here. Are you the kind of person that actually, since we're talking about this, that you look on scenes like this and think, you know what, this is how I would write this if it was in the story? If you watch like a horror movie or something like that.
I don't know, I think in general I'm quite squeamish. So you have Dr. Pimple Popper over there, and my wife loves that, and I'm the one with my eyes closed going, oh my God, no, she's squeezing something out of a spot. I can't do it. So for a horror writer, I'm incredibly squeamish. But maybe that's not a bad thing in some ways.
Well, yeah, you don't want to become like numb to it. Otherwise, it gets a little weird. Well, Richard, this has been a really wonderful time talking to you. This book is absolutely amazing. But the people want to know, of course, what's next?
So I have literally finished the I's and dotting the T's, crossing the I's and dotting the T's on another novella. I actually wrote it a number of years ago, and it was setting a nursing home. It's also horror. It's not going to sound like it if I'm not careful. So setting a nursing home in the UK. And it was with a publisher, and they were going to publish it. It was going to come out in 2020. But it was a nursing home, and it was about death. And in the UK, we had huge scandal about what was going on with COVID and deaths. So we pulled it. So I've literally just rewritten it, tidied it up, gone, oh my God, what did I think I was doing? And that's just going out to publishers at the moment to see if I can get that one out soon.
Oh, very nice, very nice. All right, folks. Well, this episode has now come to a close. Of course, get your copy of One of the Dead. It's been out for a couple of months. You go to crystallakepub.com. Everything is there. Check out all the great books, all the great writers. And Richard, where do folks go to learn more about you and to check out your works?
So I have a website, which is richardfarrenbarber.co.uk. I'm really rubbish at updating it. Every now and then I scurry out there and remember to put on things that have come out and things like this, where I've appeared and infused and the like. I'm not very, but as with most people, I'm not very active on Twitter these days. Never really was, but I am quite active on Facebook, and it's not just my horror stuff, but then anything in my life, like Nottingham Forest or anything else that's going on in the world at the same time. So that's normally the best place to catch hold of me.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Richard, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate this. And folks, hope you've enjoyed the episode. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
And with that, we bring this episode to a close. Thanks for listening, and if you haven't already, check us out on Facebook under Citywide Blackout, and Twitter and Instagram under Citywide Max. You can catch this and all your favorite episodes on your favorite podcast platform, and new episodes are added every week, as well as on Boston Free Radio every Saturday at 10 p.m. You get at me at citywidemax@yahoo.com if you want to suggest a guest, submit your music, or just drop us a line. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.